Jill. I'm from the Centre for Sleep Research at UniSA, and I'm part of our Body and Brain at Work group. And at the centre we have a really cool state-of-the-art sleep laboratory, so we can get healthy people and put them in controlled conditions and give them no sleep, and give them different doses of sleep at different times of day. We can measure their physiology and their psychology outcomes from that. And then we also do a lot of work in the field, primarily with shift workers, but also anyone that works long and stressful hours that impinge on their work-life balance and impinge on their sleep time. So we've done a lot of work with healthcare, but we also work with truck drivers, train drivers, mining, pilots. And really we're interested in looking at how work hours impact on sleep, what happens when you don't get enough sleep, and how healthy, happy and safe people are at work in relation to their sleep. So I'm going to show you a mix of data today from lab studies and from field studies that talk about fatigue. And when we talk about fatigue, we're really talking about a concept that is influenced by lots of different factors, but the main three are time of day, time awake, and prior sleep. And so time of day is really important for us because we know that we've got daily or circadian rhythms in just about every aspect of our functioning you can measure. So if you measure someone's alertness, if you measure their performance, if you measure different hormones, if you measure their body temperature, they'll all have these really nice, clear 24-hour rhythms, and those rhythms are designed so that we are optimally primed for working and being awake during the day and for being asleep at night. And we know that when we mess with that, weird things start happening. So anyone that's ever gone overseas and changed time zones, where you have a plane, it's a different time zone, your body's not used to it, and you feel gross, you're cranky, your tummy upsets perhaps, so we call that jet lag. And so if we do that to ourselves in the context of work, we see similar things, and we often refer to that as shift lag. So time of day is really important. Prior sleep is really important. So I'm going to show you some data in a minute about how losing sleep can cause accumulation of fatigue across a series of days. And we know that time awake is really important. The longer we're awake, the more sleepy we feel. But fatigue isn't just about those three things. Fatigue also is influenced by how long we've been at work, what we're doing when we're at work. We can be physically fatigued, we can be mentally fatigued. It's also impacted by our family situation, our stress levels, our health, and lots of other things. So it's really how these influences come together to make us feel less than awesome and to impact negatively on our ability to function when we need to. And fatigue has a whole bunch of symptoms that are pretty easy to recognise. And so if you've ever, a lot of you probably feel fatigued right now, you'll recognise a lot of these sort of symptoms. So we're yawning if we want to go to sleep, but also things like our reaction times are slower. We have trouble thinking of our words. We have problems communicating. We can't make decisions as effectively. And we make more errors, and so I'll show you some examples of how we see that playing out in the workplace as we go through today. But it's important to say that the consequences of fatigue are not just measurable, they're also meaningful. So this isn't just a small effect that we see when we put people in a controlled laboratory environment. We actually see how fatigue plays out negatively in the workplace. So this is a graph from a group at Walter Reed in the States, and they did this study where they got people to come into their lab, and it's been a very influential study. It's a nice illustration of how even if you just lose a little bit of sleep, it can add up consecutively over a series of days. And so there's a tendency to say, oh, well, fatigue is really an issue for the shift worker. And it certainly is. But even if we work during the daytime, there's lots of us that work long hours or stressful hours and have other demands on us, which mean we get less sleep than we'd ideally need. Hands up who had 9 hours sleep last night. Yay! Do you feel awesome?
I do.
That's terrific. 7 hours? usually people, that's quite common. About 5. 5, yes, now we're saying. And what about 3? Yeah. So you might be able to recognise your own performance on this figure. So what this shows is, this is day across the x-axis, B is baseline, E is the experimental period, and these are people that come into the laboratory and they're randomised to a series of conditions. So the squares are people with 9-hour time in bed, the triangles are the 7-hour, the 5-hour are the diamonds, and the 3-hour are the circles. And this is mean response speed. And so what you can see is if you have 9-hour opportunities across a series of 7 days, your performance is relatively flat and stabilised. Even if you get 7-hour opportunities, which is really common, you still see this decline over a series of days. 5 hours, you can definitely see this marked decline in performance, and 3 hours, you're in big trouble. And so we have a lot of people have paid very close attention to this study, and it actually had a sister study which looked at sleep loss for the other doses. So it looked at 8, 6, 4, and it found very nice complementary results. And the other thing that the other study found, which was done at the University of Pennsylvania, was that if you have 6-hour sleep opportunities for 2 weeks in a row, then your performance is equivalent to someone who's been up all night. So these effects they don't just add up, they add up to levels that we'd actually start to be concerned about. So fatigue isn't just the problem of the shift worker, it's everybody's problem. And we know that this is important because if we look at performance in the field and we look at real world performance, we see how fatigue impacts negatively. And this is just one study that is, I like using as an example because it turns the impact of fatigue into dollars. So we did this study with train drivers, and we used the black boxes in their trains which record everything that's going on in the train at very, very frequent intervals. So you get an idea of fuel use and braking and throttle use, all of those kinds of things. And so these graphs are train drivers at low, moderate and high levels of fatigue. And what's on the y-axis here is their fuel use in litres. So you can see that as they get more tired, they use more fuel. And I've just included this graph because this is the target fuel use that they're supposed to use on this particular trip that we followed them on. And you can see that when they're at a high level of fatigue, they use more fuel than they're supposed to. So now they're driving the train at a level that would be considered to be inefficient from the company's perspective. And if we just look at this one corridor, which was a rural corridor in Australia for this one train, and we conservatively estimate the cost of fuel at $1 a litre, and that is a conservative estimate, this corridor was could lose $3,500 a week, or more than $180,000 a year in fuel, just for having a fatigued driver compared to having someone who was not fatigued. And so we can see how these issues with performance can add up to reduced efficiency and increased cost in the workplace. One thing that's really interesting though is that these negative effects of fatigue don't seem to be ubiquitous, they don't seem to be consistent for everybody. And so when we study people, particularly in the lab, we can see groups of people that perform really, really well even when they're really sleep deprived. And so this is just a nice example from a study, and again this is a laboratory study, this is people doing a basic reaction time task. And there are a group here, and this is over a series of days again. So these are baseline days, and then these are sleep restriction days, SR. And we have a control group here who are not having any sleep restriction, and then all of the other lines are having 4 hours time in bed during the sleep restriction period. So you can imagine how they map onto that previous figure that we showed where they would be experiencing cumulative impairment. And so one thing you can do is you can split people into 3 groups really, and that's what this study did. It broke people into people that coped very well. So these are sleep restricted people and they're doing absolutely fine, no performance impairment at all. Then there's people that have some medium impairment, and then there's these people here who were about 16% of the sample who just did really badly across days. And at the moment, we don't have a really good way of predicting who those people are going to be. So we've looked at, can we measure different aspects of their performance and see whether they're affected the same way? The answer is no. People have looked for genetic sources, which is very interesting and ongoing, but that's complex, and we still yet to find some really good sort of answers around the genetics. And other biomarkers that we can measure, for example, can we follow hormones in someone's saliva and decide whether they're likely to be most affected by fatigue? So all of these really interesting research questions are being asked and studied at the moment. But at the moment, it's not very easy for us to tell who's going to cope well and who's not. And there's also an added complexity because we're talking about people. So these are people in the lab. But when you put someone in a real world, there's a lot of ways that their behaviour changes to try and cope with the effects of fatigue. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. One thing that happens to us when we're fatigued, when we have not enough sleep, when we have circadian disruption, is our body starts responding differently to the things that we do to it. One of the things is that it changes the way our body responds to food. And so this is a study where we had people again in the lab and we had a 4-hour sleep restriction. And we measured their glucose levels in response to different meals. And so these data are actually continuous glucose monitoring. And you'll see this is across a day. And these are the same people. Green is where they are having baseline conditions, so they've had a really good sleep. Red is after several days of 4 hours time in bed. And what you can see here is that once you put people on this 4-hour sleep restriction, their glucose responses to the same meals are elevated. So our body responds differently to the food that we eat when we're fatigued and when we lose sleep. And we're doing a lot of studies in our lab at the moment about what happens to us around eating food and our physiological responses, and whether we can change the timing of food, change the composition of food to try and keep our physiological responses constant and healthy. Because we've had researchers suggesting that this kind of response is sort of evidence for a pre-diabetic-like state that we may be inducing. And so we see increased risk of diabetes and those kinds of things in shift workers who are very frequently sleep deprived. So being fatigued and having sleep loss influences the way our body responds to things. And that's really important for us because people try to cope with the effects of fatigue in lots of behavioural ways. What's important though is to try and work out which of those strategies are helpful and which of those are harmful. And that is even more difficult because what we know about these different kinds of strategies changes when we change people's sleep-wake state, when we change people's fatigue level. So this is another example of people in our lab, and they were in there for 50 hours with no sleep. So that is quite a large chunk of sleep loss. And this time we were trialling caffeine gum. So it's little gum and it's got 200 milligrams of caffeine in it, so pretty strong coffee. And so here on this graph is hours of wakefulness up to 44.5 here. And on the y-axis is another performance measure. Now the people that are having placebo, so they're not getting the active caffeine, are in these white circles. And you can see that their performance across the 50 hours gets really bad. Now, we give them caffeine gum, look at their performance. Really rescues it. So that's terrific. However, this is quite a large dose of caffeine. And we would normally say that's going to really wreck the sleep that you get when you have the opportunity to have sleep. But these people are so sleepy, they've been awake for 50 hours. So actually, when they go to sleep, their sleep is absolutely fine. There's no negative effect of the caffeine. So the recommendations that we make about health and the trade-offs that we play around, is this going to help you stay awake now versus is it going to disrupt your sleep later and cause problems down the line? all of the basic platforms are shifting, and so we have to understand what happens in our bodies and in our physiological response and in our behaviour as we get more fatigued, so that we can understand this picture and make safe recommendations about what people can do. We know that sleep loss changes our behaviour, and one reason we look at food is because our eating behaviour changes substantially based on our work hours. And these are some shift workers here, and I show shift workers because they're a really clear example of how work hours impact on eating behaviour. This is kind of a complex looking graph, but the grey shaded bits, each line is a participant for 24 hours. The grey shaded bits are their work hours. The white bits are free living, and these little dots are their sleep. These bigger dots here are food. The bigger the dot, the more food they've eaten. And so what you can see is these are people on night shift, these are people on afternoon shift, these are people on morning shift. You can see that we've shifted their work, we've shifted their sleep around the clock, and we've also shifted when they eat. And it's also everywhere, it's a big mess. Everybody's eating at different times, which is really different to the normal breakfast, lunch and dinner that you'd expect someone working a 9 to 5 work schedule. So we're changing people's behaviour, and their bodies have to respond to that. And as we saw in one of the previous slides, the way bodies respond to food can be different when we're sleep deprived, can be different at different times of day. And so we need to understand what impact that's having. So then with this in mind, it's not really that surprising that we see these increases in things like obesity and type 2 diabetes in people that work shift work, in people that work long and stressful hours, because when you're working these kind of hours, and when you're being stressed, and when you're shifting your behaviour, when you're shifting your sleep, then you end up eating at times of day where your body's not really used to it. You may choose food that's not particularly good for you because you're tired. You might crave something that's really sweet. I've got a PhD student that's looking at food choice when people are sleepy and on different types of shifts, Georgina Heath, and she's done some really interesting stuff about the kinds of food that people on shifts choose. So you might choose different food that might not be good for you, you might be acting out of convenience, and you're certainly losing sleep. When this happens, all of your circadian system gets out of line, and we see disruptions in metabolism. And so this then isn't surprising that we see all of these health risks in people that are sleepy and fatigued. The other thing we see is that other aspects of people's behaviour change. So we try to do things to compensate for this fatigue we feel. We're trying to work at times where our body is telling us to sleep. We're trying to sleep at times when our body is telling us we should be awake. And because of that, we use often stimulants to try and modulate wakefulness, and we use sleep aids to try and help sleep. So we see in people that work long, regular, stressful hours, very high use of caffeine, and I myself may have had 3 coffees already today. And then we also see very, very common use of things like alcohol as a sleep aid to help people get to sleep. So some of these strategies may work in the short term, but of course you can see where this is done to excess and where this is done chronically, that this may be another arm that is explaining some of these health issues that we see in people that work these hours. So we do know that people are trying to cope with fatigue. They're doing their best. And so there's lots of things that people do. And one of the things that we're really interested in our centre is trying to work out what people do, and then work out which of those things are good, which of those things aren't really doing much, which of those things are harmful. And that's really, really useful, because we know that if we look at people that work long and stressful hours, and we look at people that have done that for a long time, there's a group of people that are ill, that are struggling to cope, and there's another group that are doing fantastically. So they mimic the data that we see in the lab. So the key for us now, I think, is to understand why some people do really well and why some people don't. What behaviours are they doing? How are they trying to manage their fatigue? And are they doing it successfully? If they are, then we have to harvest those strategies, and then we can tell other people and come up with behavioural interventions to try and improve some of the outcomes of long and stressful work. And so people use a whole bunch of countermeasures that we know about, like naps and caffeine, other sort of helpful techniques to wind down for sleep, and then they also use other strategies to try and shift the risk while they're at work. So if they have to do safety critical activities, they might avoid doing it at 4 or 5 a.m. They might do it earlier in their shift, so there's less chance of error, people help each other out, people look for other people who are tired and double check and do other things, increase communication to try and avoid performance impairment while people are fatigued on shift. And just as a quick example of that, this is some data that we have looked at in nurses, in Australian nurses, and you can see on the x-axis here, days off, work days, and then this is days where they reported making an error, days where they reported nearly making an error, and days where they reported someone else making an error. This is their sleep duration. You can see on days off, they had more sleep than they did when they were at work. And on days where they made an error or nearly made an error, they had less sleep than they did on other work days. What was really interesting is that the days that they caught somebody else in their team making an error, they had more sleep than they normally do at work. And so this suggests that fatigue is not only affecting people's own performance, but it may influence the way they work in teams and may negatively impact on our ability to catch errors in other people. Of course, if we're going to be positive about that, we could look at it this way, that those who have more sleep look out for others, and I think that's a much more helpful way of looking at it, and that's sort of one of the areas that we're trying to pursue, what makes a healthy team and how do we capitalise on that. And we know that there's a whole lot of stuff that we can do about fatigue, and a lot of it is very helpful. So we know that fatigue-friendly rostering helps, although it's not the full answer, and we could probably debate that for the next 10 years. But certainly if you have, you can make a difference in how you roster. We know that fatigue education also helps, but it's important for that education to look at causes, consequences and coping, not just look at how much fatigue is present in a system. However, we know that those solutions are never going to fix everything because it's an imperfect system, we're people, and it's complex. So what should science be doing right now about this? And I think that we're changing the questions we ask in light of this complexity and in light of the fact that some people aren't doing well and some people are doing great. And so up till now we've had a tendency to ask questions like how many fatigue-related accidents occur, what are the negative consequences of fatigue in a workplace, why are fatigue workers at risk of health outcomes, but I think it's much more useful for us to say, why aren't there more fatigue-related accidents? Everyone is walking around tired. What do we do to stop that turning into something that's a disaster? And I think we can learn a lot from that. Also, what keeps some shift workers safe and healthy? So why are some getting diabetes? Sure, but why are some not? So these shifts in the way we do our work are really important. So our overall focus then is to look for people who are doing well, find out why they're doing well, and use that information to help promote safe, healthy workplaces. And so we're doing a lot of work in that area now. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
With friendly rostering, what are your hints around that?
Well, I guess SafeWork Australia have some pretty good guidelines on fatigue-friendly rostering, don't they? So considering that there's adequate time off for people to get sleep and not just having enough time off, but having enough time off at the right times of day. So if you have a long period off during the daytime, it's very hard to sleep. It's important to acknowledge that you're probably going to achieve less sleep and light quality during that period off. Trying to think about whether you should limit the length or the number of night shifts in a row. And there's always a balance between having rosters that work operationally, having rosters that work based on people's desire for time off at socially desirable times, and having rosters that help with fatigue. So it's a balance. But even if you have the perfect roster, as we see, even if people are working 9 to 5, 4 or 5 days a week, and they have plenty of time off, there's always going to be times when people can't get enough sleep for lots of different reasons, and so fatigue is always going to be an issue that we need to deal with. Yes, who's next?
Have you done any studies of how long it takes to catch up if you've been very sleep deprived? I want to say a little bit about that. I mean, can you like sleep deprived during the week and then catch up on the weekend?
Well, that's a very common technique. And it's actually been debated because, sure, you can have reduced sleep during the week and then binge sleep on weekends. And you might feel a bit better, but you're probably actually going to feel a little bit worse to start with, and then you might feel a bit better. But there's debate about that because you're doing two things. One is you're resaturating your sleep system, which might be healthy, but the other thing is you're affecting your sleep. So I think there would be some sleep experts that would say, no, it's much better to stay on a consistent timing pattern rather than to do some massive oversleeping on the weekends. But I don't think that as a community we have a really good answer to that. The other thing is we have done a series of recovery studies in our lab where we kept people awake for either 1 or 2 full nights, and then we gave them different doses of sleep over a series of days to see how long it did take them to recover. And what we found was that when we limited people's recovery opportunities to about 6 hours, which is very common, it took them several days to recover, and it also took different functions, different times to recover. So we saw that mood didn't recover at the same rate as sleep architecture, which didn't recover at the same rate as performance. And so one of the questions about recovery is recovery from what, for what? And the other thing that we found, which was really interesting, is when we didn't limit their sleep and we didn't tell them what time to go to bed, we said just go to bed whenever you want and sleep for as long as you want, then performance recovered very quickly. So I personally think, and this isn't necessarily strong evidence-based suggestion, but this is what I think from that study, is that people can feel and intuitively about what they need, and if we let people choose when they recover for how long, they can actually do quite a good job, but they need to have that opportunity. Yes.
You often hear of people being referred to as morning larks or night owls.
Yes.
Do you notice a difference with that in the sleep studies with shift workers? That the night owls maybe cope better with night shift than a morning lark would? Or?
There is certainly that suggestion, and there's also suggestions about whether morning or evening types adapt faster to schedules, and so whether it's better for evening types to be on slower rotating versus fast rotating schedules, for example. However, one thing that's very difficult to measure if you're doing shift work is whether you're a lark or an owl, because the way we work that out is we ask people what time they would normally go to bed, what time they would normally wake up, and we measure things like their body temperature in the middle of their sleep period and stuff like that. And once you put someone on a shift work roster, you could argue that those kind of questions are a little bit meaningless because we've artificially messed people up from a chronobiological perspective. So that becomes difficult. But certainly larks and owls, we do see different performance at different times of day, and we know that there's a synchrony effect. So if you test an evening type in the evening, they're going to have better performance than a morning type in the evening, and if you test a morning type in the morning, they're going to have better performance than an evening type in the morning. Yeah.
My question was the
Oh, interesting.
It might be a silly question, but in the studies that they did it show any significant difference whether it was the age or the gender of the person?
So in most of the studies in the lab that I showed, they are young. Sorry, I'm cutting myself out of the Spielberg production. For most of the studies in the lab, they're done with young, healthy people that have been screened. So we're talking sort of 18 to 30, 35-year-olds. But in the field, there's suggestions about the fact that it might be more difficult to cope with shift work as you get older, that there's different patterns in things like caffeine use with increasing age. But there's a problem with measuring simple relationships between age and coping, because we know that people that have trouble coping with shift work, there's a group of those that will drop out of the workforce. And then there's also people who have very, very good skills and are able to cope with shift work, who will stay in the workforce for a very long time. So actually, if we look at age, there's kind of two clusters. There's older workers that are struggling more, and then there's older workers that have very, very good coping. So we kind of see separation there.
Thank you.